here at UNC at Chapel Hill, and I'm just delighted that you've joined us here this morning. We have a number of activities scheduled for the day, starting with a tribute to Dr. Fred Kilgore, one of the world's foremost innovators and intellectuals who passed away in July of last year. We'll then hear from Michael Tiemann, Vice President of Open Source Affairs for Red Hat, who will present today's OCLC Frederick G. Kilgore Lecture in Information and Library Science, which was established in Dr. Kilgore's honor to promote scholarly exchange. Michael will address the topic, Sharing Knowledge, Multiplying Value, the Non-Linear Nature of Open Source Software. This afternoon, over in the School of Government, we have a special forum with a keynote presentation and panel discussions on the topic of the future of the profession, educational needs of information and library science professionals in the 21st century, and that we hope you'll join us for this important discussion. But we begin this morning's session with a tribute to Dr. Fred Kilgore. Dr. Kilgore was a valued colleague and mentor to many of us assembled here today. To the faculty, staff, students, and alumni of the School of Information and Library Science, where he served as Distinguished Research Professor from 1990 until he retired in 2004, and to our visitors from OCLC Online Computer Library Center, which he founded in 1967, and to many in the library and information professions who were influenced and affected by Fred's activities and accomplishments. Today's celebration is one of the tributes to Fred's work since his passing, the first being held in Dublin, Ohio at OCLC in October, and another held at the American Library Association's Midwinter Conference, where many of his colleagues and admirers gathered to pay their respects and celebrate his many successes. To start the proceedings, it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce Jay Jordan, the President and Chief Executive Officer of OCLC Online Computer Library Center. In 1998, Jay became the fourth president of the company that Dr. Kilgore founded. He leads the non-profit membership computer library service and research organization that's dedicated to public purposes, furthering access to the world's information and reducing information costs. Jay.
Thank you, Dean Griffiths. I'm here to join you all today in tribute to Frederick G. Kilgore, who was a librarian, a teacher, an entrepreneur, and historian of science, a great American, indeed, a true citizen of the world. I believe that when we honor Fred, we must also honor Eleanor, his wife, friend, and editor for 63 years. We thank her for sharing Fred with the library community for all of those years. Many of you know Eleanor. May I ask just a show of hands, how many actually had encountered Fred or knew him or brushed up against him? It's amazing. Thank you. Frederick Ridley Kilgore was born in Springfield, Massachusetts in 1914. He must have stood out as a young man in many ways, for he was admitted to study at Harvard College as the Great Depression was beginning. This was a time, of course, when many young people counted themselves fortunate to complete high school. The realities of the times demanded that he work to pay his way. On top of his studies, he would work 48 to 60 hours a week at such jobs as washing dishes in the Harvard Law School Eating Club, and eventually as a student worker in Harvard's Widener Library. Fred completed his undergraduate degree in chemistry in 1935. He had wanted to go to medical school, but hard times persisted, and he felt the need to help support his family. As a student worker, Fred had caught the eye of the leaders of the library, and Harvard College librarian Keys Metcalf created a special post as his personal assistant. As Fred noted in years later, speaking of how he came to his first job after college, quote, "He thought I had a future," unquote. These early days, visionary guy, that Keys. These early days foreshadowed many things to come. Young Kilgore published his first article in the Harvard Library Bulletin on microphotography. The article describes how the nascent technology of microphotography could, as he noted, quote, "lower the economic barrier between the scholar and his resources," end quote. It was also during this time that Fred met Eleanor Beach, who had graduated from Mount Holyoke and had taken a job at the Harvard College Library. In 1940, he and Eleanor were married. Another library connection. With the coming of war, because of his education in science and work with microfilming, Fred was called to join the Office of Strategic Services. There, among many duties, he was to initiate and direct a system for obtaining publications from enemy nations and enemy-occupied areas. For his wartime service, he received the Legion of Merit. From 1946 to 48, he served as Deputy Director in the Office of Intelligence Collection and Dissemination in the U.S. Department of State. But life in the university, again, based in libraries, called. In 1948, Fred became librarian of the Medical Library at Yale, and as a member of the History Department, he also taught courses in the history of science and the history of medicine, and published in those fields. The years at Yale are replete with examples of these experiments and the applications of new technologies to the work of libraries, and many, many publications, including Fred's service as the first editor of the Journal of Library Automation. During the 50s and 60s, no one interested in the applications of new technologies to information science and the work of libraries worldwide could fail to call on Fred Kilgore. He was everywhere, or so it seemed, as speaker, consultant, contributor to so many proceedings. By 1967, Fred had been lured to Ohio to establish what was to be the Ohio College Library Center, hence the acronym OCLC. Its chartered public purpose, as the dean said, was to further access to the world's information and to reduce the rate of rise of library costs. Those purposes still guide the cooperative today. Nearly 40 years ago, OCLC was just Fred and one secretary at work in two small rooms in the main library at The Ohio State University. From there, Fred took the theoretical and practical basis of librarianship into entirely new directions. In less than 4 years, he managed to launch online network cataloging, with Ohio University in Athens, Ohio, doing the honors of loading the first record. Today, that online union catalog has become OCLC WorldCat, has grown to more than 84 million records and more than 1.1 billion location listings. The OCLC Cooperative now connects libraries in 110 nations around the world, and in many ways, beyond the foundation of online cataloging, almost all of which ideas Fred anticipated decades ago. Ralph Waldo Emerson once wrote that an institution is the lengthened shadow of an individual. For OCLC, that individual is Fred Kilgore. In many ways, we at OCLC continue to act on the plans that he set forth in his original vision for OCLC nearly 40 years ago. Fred's vision, in short, was to provide information to people when and where they wanted it. That was Fred's life's work, and the world is a much better place for his efforts. One of the more succinct descriptions of Fred's leadership can be found in the text of the Melville Dewey Medal, which he received in 1978. I'll share part of it with you. Quote, "First, he was a thoroughly competent librarian. Second, he had a high degree of technical acumen. Third, he was a consummate politician. And fourth, he had skin a foot thick, which was fortunate indeed, because we fought him every step of the way en route to the promised land. He may even have out-Dewey'd Dewey." As I have noted, Fred has also been a lecturer in the history of science at Yale, and he brought that background to his management practices. Long-term employees of OCLC tell me that when you were in a meeting with Fred, tackling the problems of building an international library network, sooner or later you would get to hear an anecdote about Aristotle or Newton or Eli Whitney or the Wright brothers. He could put current challenges and problems into perspective, and with Fred, perspectives might take you back 4,000 years to problems of searching 16-foot-long Egyptian papyrus rolls, and then fast forward to the use of color in today's electronic text. That, folks, is historical perspective. I feel very fortunate to have known Fred for the past 8 years. We would talk from time to time, and he was always very supportive and encouraging. The last time I saw Fred was in February of 2006, when Lorcan Dempsey, OCLC's Vice President of Research and Chief Strategist, and I had lunch with Fred and Eleanor here in Chapel Hill at the Carolina Inn. Lorcan was here to deliver the inaugural presentation in the OCLC Frederick G. Kilgore Lecture Series. And both Fred and Eleanor were in very good spirits, and they were gratified to see the lecture series was indeed going forward, and especially pleased that Lorcan was to deliver the first lecture in the series. On July 31st of this year, it was a sad day at OCLC. The flags were at half-mast. Condolences to the Kilgore family were starting to come in from around the world. On August 2nd, the news of Fred's death was the lead obituary in the New York Times. We at OCLC were quite proud of that. I don't know if any of you saw the obituary, but it had a charming ending. After explaining Fred's contributions to librarianship and education, the writer mentioned the launch of WorldCat.org and the making of the OCLC database available to anyone on the internet. The obituary stated, quote, Mr. Kilgore wrote The Evolution of the Book, published by Oxford University Press in 1998. According to a beta version of WorldCat, made available to the New York Times yesterday, the book can be found at more than 500 libraries throughout the United States, from the Anchorage Municipal Library in Alaska to the Yakima Valley Community College Library in Washington State, unquote. The writer concluded, quote, if it is more convenient, copies may also be borrowed from the Erasmus University Medical Library in the Netherlands, the National Library Board of Singapore, and the National University Library of Iceland, among other places. Clearly, Fred's vision lives. As I go to work each day in the Kilgore building at OCLC, I have to walk by a portrait of Fred. It's in the atrium, and I never fail to ask myself if I have a plan for that day, which will in fact move OCLC closer to achieving its goals. At night, when I leave my office, which overlooks Lake Fred, I have to walk by Fred's portrait again. And I ask myself, did I accomplish enough today? Fred set the bar dauntingly high, but the joy of stretching to achieve the vision is exciting and energizing. In January 2004, Fred published his 205th scholarly paper. It was entitled, An Experiment Using Coordinate Title Word Searches. He had just turned 90 years old. To write this article, he worked with information science researchers here at the University of North Carolina and the University of Michigan. The first sentence of his final scholarly article summed up Fred's approach to research. He wrote, quote, much remains to be done, end quote. In his poem, The Psalms of Life, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote, lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime, and departing leave behind us footprints on the sands of time. Let us then be up and doing with a heart for any fate, still achieving, still pursuing, learn to labor and to wait. So Fred has done much and he's left much for us to do. So thank you. We'll carry on with enthusiasm. Thank you.
OCLC produced a video. We have a shortened version of that video to show here today.
Good morning, all. I understand we have an overflow crowd out in the atrium. What a wonderful occasion. So I just told Fred I can't draw like this. I can't fill half of this place, never mind overflows. So, which is totally appropriate from my standpoint.
You're lucky you have that man leading you, because he's accomplished quite a few things that I failed. I tried. Phil Cheever gave me a sort of a outline of what to talk about, and I will talk about that. But as far as the future is concerned, he didn't have that in here. I'm not going to talk about the future of OCLC. I'm going to talk about the future of you, and you, and you. The futures that individuals have that develop that is important. And each one of you, I'm sure, has thought of something that would improve getting information to people that nothing was done about. Unfortunately, it was perhaps because you didn't do anything about it. But it's important for you, when you get your ideas, to push them ahead. And I'll give you one example. When I was an undergraduate at Harvard, in my senior year, I charged out books at the delivery desk, as we called it. And then when I graduated in 1935 in the depth of the Depression, needless to say, there weren't a lot of jobs available for chemists, and I was a chemistry major. So I kept the job I had, namely charging out books. In 1936, a book called Gone with the Wind appeared, and it was extraordinarily popular. And one day I checked the waiting list, and there were 48 people waiting for that copy that Harvard had. And we charged it out for a month each time, so that was only 4 years that you had to wait. I tried to do something about it. Remember, this is 1936, well before practically everything. That's the fact, before most of you appeared. It occurred, I went to the order department and asked them to buy some copies. Couldn't do it. Some lawyer in the 19th century had declared that it was illegal to buy an extra copy of a book that was already in the library. And they weren't going to do it. So then it occurred to me after a while that Harvard graduates had bought Gone with the Wind and probably weren't going to read it again, and maybe they'd give me copies. So I put a little note in the Harvard Bulletin, and sure enough, I got about, I forgot, it was 3 or 4 copies. And then, of course, the catalogers didn't want to add it to the collection. So I got through that finally, and we finally had 5 copies, but I never was able to reduce the circulation period to 2 weeks for wet bud. It takes some doing, as you can see, and you have to get out and around and talk with people you never met before, but do it. Your ideas are important, and your personal futures, the personal futures that you see are important.
I am very glad to have the opportunity to pay tribute to Fred Kilgore. I have very few heroes in the library and information world, but he is certainly one of the few. There are not many instances of entrepreneurs in library history, but Fred is surely a shining example. I met Fred in person only 3 or 4 times at national and international conferences, and most of my contact with him was by occasional correspondence and much more by reading about him and the genesis and growth of OCLC. Fred was responsible for initiating one of the greatest changes and developments in library practice of the 20th century, transforming the way cataloging was done, transforming interlibrary lending, and doing more for resource sharing than anyone else. In the process, he must have been responsible for millions of dollars in savings. I'm sure Fred had a vision, but I doubt if even he envisioned how OCLC would grow. In 1967, library automation, we should remember, was still in its infancy. Some librarians knew it must be useful, only they could think how to use it. Fred knew perfectly well. While others fussed about the minutiae of bibliographic description, Fred thought in terms of what worked, even if it did not meet the approval of perfectionists. And work it did and does, incredibly successfully. Many others have, of course, played major parts in OCLC's development, especially since Fred stepped down in 1980. But Fred sowed the seeds and watered them. Fred may have departed this life, but his monument lives on and will be a central part of library service for the foreseeable future, whatever shapes it evolves into.
As you probably know, Fred Kilgore, when he stepped down as president of OCLC, remained on the board for another 14 years from 1981 to 1995. I had the pleasure and the honor of serving with him most of that time. The major issue that I remember most vividly about Fred and the board was the debate toward the end of his tenure where we discussed whether OCLC should continue to serve its end users through libraries or whether we should start going directly to the end users. It was a major debate within the board, and it was a major debate within the library community. You can imagine where Fred came out, since he was always looking forward. 10 years later, now, in 2006, we're finally fulfilling his goal with the new partnership with Google and the use of the internet, going directly to the users, but then linking them to our holdings. So once again, Fred was ahead of his time.
I would like to have accomplished this, get a system going for real that retrieves information directly from within documents and makes it available to users wherever they are when they ask for it. I may not do that, but it'll be done. And it doesn't bother me that I didn't do it, but I played a part in it, and users are going to benefit from it, and that's always been, for 50 years and more, has been the driving force in my professional career. And I don't fret that it got kind of shortchanged a little bit. Just like Mendel, you know, is always, or is almost always depicted as greatly disappointed because his idea of the what we now call the genes and the biological inheritance was not accepted. He was certainly disappointed, but it wasn't for that reason. It was a reason that the Austrian government began taxing his monastery, and he couldn't persuade him to adopt a tax a monastery. And that occupied most of his last years. But I was in his garden once. It still exists in Brno. His beehives. And as I stood in that garden, he came from a family of orchardists, and I just knew that he knew that what he had done was important, and was important for people like that, even if he didn't see the importance come about.
Some people are visionaries and some people are pragmatists. Fred was a remarkable combination of each. He thought broadly and in a visionary way about information, how people sought out information in books, how they got to the books, how they used them. But he also thought in a very pragmatic way. How does one organize across organizations so they could most effectively make those books available? And that led to his creation of OCLC, which started in Ohio and then spread around the nation and then around the world, which organized across lots of organizations, now 50,000 libraries, to help people work together to catalog books. That organizational skill was something very special. I also admired Fred, whom I knew for over 20 years, because of the way in which he had a zest for what he was doing. After he retired from OCLC, he continued working hard and continuously on the way in which people used libraries. And I remember many calls from him where he would tell me about the new findings he had developed from his research on how libraries were used. And that commitment to a cause was something that is part of his legacy, which I will remember, and I think library users will benefit from forever.
I think you'll agree, an extraordinary man, extraordinary life. Extraordinary life. Many of you in this room have met Eleanor Kilgore. Many of you have not. We have been in contact with Eleanor over the past several months. She was planning to be here today. We spoke to her yesterday, and she regrets not being with us, but she indicates that she's very honored that you've gathered here for this occasion today, and she sends her greetings to all of you, and we will in turn send your greetings back to her. It was truly a great honor for the School of Information and Library Science when Fred joined us as a distinguished research professor in 1990. With us today are some of SIL's faculty members who worked closely with Fred. Joe Hewitt is the Emeritus Associate Provost for University Libraries, Director of Academic Affairs Libraries of UNC at Chapel Hill's Library System, and Professor Emeritus at SILS. Joe was head of the UNC Libraries during Fred's tenure at SILS, and he will start a tribute from a UNC perspective. Joe.
Good morning. This will be more from a personal perspective than the UNC perspective. But I am honored to have this opportunity to say a few words about Fred Kilgore. Fred's work, of course, has had a transformative impact on the delivery of library and information services in the 20th century, a story that is well known to all of us. And I thought instead of talking about that, I would talk about a few of Fred's personal qualities that I believe his accomplishments are based on, and which I admire very much. And you've heard some already this morning describe these much more eloquently than I will. I first met Fred in 1973 when I came to Columbus to talk to him about some research that I was planning to do on the impact of OCLC on the 47 original member libraries. I was doing this in part as a consultation for the Bibliographical Center for Research, the Rocky Mountains region in Denver, and also for a dissertation. I visited Fred at the Ohio State University Computer Center, where the OCLC offices were at the time. These were not luxurious quarters by any means. They had that sort of vaguely industrial quality that computer centers at the time tended to have. But Fred seemed right at home. He was very hands-on and engaged in what he was doing. And we had a very stimulating several hours of conversation that afternoon and the next morning. What impressed me most about Fred then was his intellectual curiosity and his engagement, a quality that never deserted him. It had shown itself in his earliest days at Yale, which he liked to talk about a lot, by the way, right up to his time here at Carolina. And he would come to my office once or twice a year to tell me about a paper he was going to deliver in Kiel or some other less than exotic place in Europe. Always kidded him that he ought to get invited to Florence. Or he would tell me about a study that he was going to do with a SIL student. But he always began our discussion by explaining in some detail the many deficiencies of the UNC OPAC. And by the way, Fred, even in his later years, was still interested in search algorithms, which was what he was interested in on the first day I met him. But in the early days of OCLC, Fred did a great deal of writing to describe, explain, and interpret OCLC to the world. He took full responsibilities for these ideas, and he became known for his intellectual leadership, not just leadership as the founder of a great organization. And this is a quality that I believe is badly needed in the leadership of many of our library institutions and organizations today. The ability to combine intellectual and organizational or institutional leadership. So that's the first quality. Secondly, in addition to his intellectual curiosity, Fred was a visionary, but not just the ordinary sort of vaporous visionary so common in our profession today. He conceived the how in addition to the what and the why. He saw the way from here to there. I like to think of Fred more as an architect of visions, not merely a visionary, and there is indeed a world of difference. The one is very rare, and the other is a dime a dozen. Third, Fred was tough, very tough. We today tend to forget the political turmoil that raged in the library world in the early days of OCLC. I visited every one of the 47 member libraries, founding member libraries. It was an interesting experience, to say the least. There was enormous diversity of institutions, of types and sizes of libraries, of programs and resources, personalities and goals, and ideas about resource sharing, from the really very sound to the far out, to use a term from that period. Fred was greatly admired, a hero to many in these libraries, but in some there was an active and very vocal animosity. I discussed this with Fred on several occasions, and his reaction is always very bold. At the Bibliographic Center for Research, for example, I recommended that they begin negotiating with OCLC to see if they could acquire access to their services. At the time, OCLC only served libraries in Ohio. But my proposal was rejected. Instead, BCR embarked on a costly and very wasteful development of their own system, which of course they had to abandon in time. When I came to UNC in 1975, Solinet had also embarked on the same ill-advised course of action, a separate bibliographic network for the Southeast, wasting a great deal of time and money in the process. The not invented here syndrome was rampant in those days. People were afraid of OCLC's expansionism, and many saw Fred as a bibliographic Napoleon, and he was. Even in those days, he did see the benefits of national and worldwide scale and comprehensiveness. His ideas are so accepted today that we seem to have forgotten the resistance they engendered in the early years. You have to remember, too, that this was all occurring at a time when the autocratic male university library director was not yet in decline. And I remember Jim Gavan, my predecessor at UNC, told me once, he was a founding member of the board of Solomon, that there are members of that board whose idea of negotiation is to go behind the library to the loading dock and slug it out. And so that was the environment that Fred was working in. So in my 30 years plus of association with Fred, what impressed me most was his lifelong intellectual curiosity, which I think also accounted for his extraordinary productivity in retirement. His ability to be an architect and builder of visions that address the most widespread and basic problems of library services, and his toughness in withstanding the opposition and criticism that always confront the great innovator. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Rebecca Varga is Stills librarian and current president of the Special Libraries Association. She's had a very close relationship with Fred and his wife Eleanor for a number of years. Rebecca.
Good morning. One of the most innovative librarians I've ever had the privilege of talking with on a regular basis was Fred Kilgore. I started my career in interlibrary loan about 30 years ago, and Fred Kilgore was one of those wonderful people who changed it for generations and generations of us. He was truly an innovator. During the first 3 years of my current job here at the University of North Carolina, Fred was actively involved in research, and he used our library resources on a weekly basis. You always knew when it was Monday afternoon because he was in our reading room using the collection. Quite frankly, you could almost set your calendar by it. He had a marvelous intellectual curiosity about a broad spectrum of topics, ranging from early photography, about things like the Draeger camera, which we learned a great deal about, to trends in information science. Fred and Eleanor lived at the retirement community of Carolina Meadows in a very lovely, lovely home. And one of the activities that they have at Carolina Meadows in this retirement community is bird watching. And you may or may not know that Fred and Eleanor were avid bird watchers. They had a very large picture window in their dining area with a wonderful bird feeder. So every time a student and I would go out to take some materials out to Fred or to just stop by for a visit, Fred would treat us to one of his excellent lectures about the current species of birds at that particular time of year. I'm telling you, it was a rare treat. Eleanor also talked about the wonderful adventures that they had while they were traveling before Fred retired. She and Fred would always take their LL Bean boots and their binoculars, especially when they were making trips to London. And they had excellent opportunities to bird watch, particularly in the parks of London, and they had wonderful memories of that activity. Now, a little bit closer to home, in 2004, in Chapel Hill, they had some excitement at Carolina Meadows among the birding community. Eleanor and Fred were known as expert birders, and what they ended up finding on one of their counting days, they put up a hummingbird feeder, and they were hoping to find a winter hummingbird. This was very, very rare. And again, 2004, and they're not very easy to identify. So I know you're not surprised when I tell you that they were very, very successful, and lo and behold, they saw the bird and they saw it on counting day. It was a rufous hummingbird. I knew Fred would want me to tell you precisely what type of hummingbird it was. But this is normally found in the far west. It is not found here. So this was a banner day. And just one of those wonderful aspects of Fred's personality that I wanted to share with you this morning. Through the last several years, Fred had been working. You've heard about how productive he was. And especially over the last couple of years, he was working on his biography. This is also not going to surprise you that it was not a typical biography in the usual sense. He organized the material as a history of science, from the abacus to the history of computing. In other words, how Fred got his ideas. He was very purposeful, so naturally he was writing his biography in the same manner. On April 7th, 2006, I visited Fred at his home one last time, and we discussed many subjects, from the current technology to the SLA annual conference, which took place in Baltimore, Maryland. Fred Kilgore became an honorary member of SLA in 1986, and he was truly a creative innovator. But I also want to mention how much he enjoyed students. He was fascinated with the types of courses that students were currently taking. And Fred was very generous. He and Eleanor donated their personal library to our collection. So over the last couple of years, we've been working on that process of bringing the materials in. So I used the opportunity as a teachable moment with our students to take a couple of students with me to go out and collect materials. Well, we took a laptop. Well, you know what happened next. We had the most marvelous afternoon. Fred wanted to know how we set up the database, how we were going to retrieve it. He was absolutely fascinated. It was a wonderful time. And Fred and Eleanor so enjoyed the students and had so much to contribute. Fred could see the impact of technology in terms of access to information. Before personal computers and the internet, there was Fred Kilgore. His legacy of innovation, creativity, and collaboration is an inspiration for all of us. Thank you.
Dr. Gary Marcianini is the Carrie C. Boschema Distinguished Professor at SILS. He and Fred spent many hours talking about projects that could make a difference to our students and possibilities that could change how the world accessed information. Gary?
I probably knew Fred personally the least amount of time of anyone that we'll hear from today. But those days of since 1998, when I arrived here in Chapel Hill, were special in that, as Rebecca said, on those Mondays, Fred would be in our hall, and we would stand mostly, but so occasionally we would sit and talk. And it was actually really interesting to talk with Fred, because he didn't talk to you, he talked with you. For someone of his stature, that's really quite a remarkable achievement. He was, as we've heard, anxious to talk with students and with faculty. And I must say that the way I think of Fred is he's sort of the father of digital libraries. And that's no small accomplishment. We've heard a lot about his qualities and characteristics, and the words that came to my mind as I thought about what I might say are vision and action. So he not only had the vision, but he did things. He didn't just sort of write about ideas. He actually took action. He built stuff. He, OCLC being one of the, of course, great accomplishments. He was a passionate researcher. He cared. He was curious. He didn't just do it because he was in an academic institution and he thought people might expect him to do that. He really, really cared about the named entities And one of the things we had in common was a passion for the end user. But I was sort of out of it because I was thinking about full text retrieval and things of that sort. And Fred was going, well, no, it's those named entities, those known item searches that everyone's ignoring. They're really hard, especially when you have millions and millions of objects and databases. So over the years, he convinced me that there was actually, that wasn't a trivial problem. I'll have sort of one anecdote that I think actually captures Fred, certainly for me. During our conversations, he would pass on papers. So here's a paper that he gave me, 1961 paper in which he actually used data from the Yale Medical Library to demonstrate how they could transition from a paper-based catalog to an electronic catalog. They didn't just do it because there were computers, and computers were cool. He did it from a cost basis. He actually had the data to show this was something that we could do in a feasible sort of way, and here's a pattern that we could use over time. We're not just going to throw all the cards away, but we're going to transition, and here's a path toward that. So he had the action and the vision in a way that's really quite rare, especially in academia. The anecdote goes something like this, though. Fred was really interested in interlibrary loan. And I didn't quite get it. It was, well, yeah, there are these cards and people fill them out and magically stuff arrives, and that's just how it works. He was a very patient man, but eventually I think he may have gotten a bit exasperated at me, and he dragged me over to Davis Library and actually introduced me to the people who did this work and showed me how it worked. Now, this was a time when they were taking the cards and phasing them out and moving to the Iliad system. Remember these, anyone? So you have no idea what I'm holding up. This is an interlibrary loan card here. So Fred convinced me that if we looked at these cards, we might actually begin to see some traces of human behavior. There were patrons who would actually make a request and it would be in handwriting. There were notes from the librarian. There may be other kinds of notes that the librarians made over time, and this is a kind of evidence of human behavior. So I said, okay, you convinced me. So for about 2.5 years, every semester, when they were about to retire the cards and throw them away, they called me, and I would run over there with my little 2-wheel cart and bring back 1 or 2 boxes of interlibrary loan cards. So we have about somewhere near 25,000 of these cards, much to the chagrin of Rebecca and Scott Adams and others who keep saying, why are all these boxes in the stacks and hiding in the here and there? I tried for years to get students to take an interest in these cards and do a study, but no one seemed to want to take it on. So about 2 years ago, I convinced 2 of our current doctoral students, Billy Liu is here and David West is here, to work with me, and actually they did the work, on a study of these interlibrary loan cards with respect to the electronic system. So they did a sample and painstakingly looked at about 2,000 of these cards and about 2,000 of the electronic records and did a comparative study that it resulted in a paper that's now in review dedicated to Fred Kilgore. This is the kind of man he was. He was an inspiration. He didn't sort of lead by fiat, he led by example. And I think that this is something to emulate. It's something that, for me, has been an inspiration. And I hope we can all take away from the lessons we've heard in these videos and short talks about our experiences with Fred, that it's not enough to just think. We also have to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Dr. Barbara Moran was Dean of Sills from 1990 to 1998 and is currently a professor at Sills. She was Dean of Sills when Fred arrived in 1990, and she's had a close relationship with him and his wife ever since.
When I think of Fred Kilgore, one word inevitably comes into my mind, and that word is splendid. For the over 15 years I was privileged to work with Fred, I always knew he was splendid. For one reason, he always told me so. Each time I saw him and asked him how he was, he never said he was fine or that he was okay. He always said he was splendid. But even without being told, I would have known this about Fred. He excelled in so many ways, and his professional accomplishments are well known. Today, I would like to discuss 3 personal characteristics that I think made him such a splendid person. The first is intellectual curiosity. Now, I think every other speaker has mentioned this, but I don't think I have ever met anyone who was so eager to ask questions and to find answers to them. The majority of people who retire adopt a more leisurely lifestyle. Not Fred. He retired from OCLC to Chapel Hill, as he often told me, so he could do more research. He continued to research and publish until the end of his life. There were always more questions that Fred wanted to answer. He was convinced that libraries often overlook the needs of users, as some other people have said, and a great deal of the research he did was focused on that issue. I actually worked with him on several studies looking at OPACs and screen size and how many entries should be shown on each page to make OPACs more user-friendly. And like Gary, I didn't really know I was interested in that until Fred convinced me this was a really important topic. But his interests were wide-ranging. He wrote a great deal, hundreds of papers about automation and technology, but he also wrote, and Oxford University Press published in 1999, The Evolution of the Book, which explored the history of the book from clay tablets to digital books. Fred always had his notebooks at hand, and he was always working on the latest project. I think all of us who knew Fred hope that after retirement, we can maintain our intellectual interest and mental acuity as he did. He was a wonderful role model for all of us. But the second characteristic that I'd like to talk about was Fred's warmth and empathy for others. When I first met Fred, I was somewhat in awe of him. He was a legendary figure, and I felt a bit intimidated. But I soon learned that Fred was not that standoffish, self-important person that I had perhaps feared he would be, but instead he was a kind and giving individual. Let me give you a few examples. How many of you know that Fred established emergency student loan funds at numerous LIS schools across the country? Once he told me the story of why he had done this. As Jay said, he was at Harvard during the Depression, and to support himself, he washed dishes. He washed a lot of dishes, hours and hours of dishes. And once when he was washing the dishes, he cut his hand very badly on a broken dish. He always said if there had not been an emergency loan fund at Harvard, he would have had to drop out because he just could not have supported himself. He had never forgotten that experience, and because of it, he established similar funds for library science students across the country, those students who might run into temporary difficulty and have trouble supporting themselves. Throughout the time I knew him, Fred was always trying to help another person or an institution. He regularly sent books and journals to library science programs in underdeveloped countries to help build up their libraries. He was also, as many people have said, a wonderful storyteller with fascinating tales that range from his student days at Harvard through his intelligence work in World War II to one that he told me a lot about autopsies. He attended while he was at Yale, but he always had these wonderful stories, and many of them concerned the early days at OCLC when it was just Fred and an assistant. I was always impressed with how down-to-earth and personable this icon of librarianship actually was. But the third characteristic I would like to mention is his interest in education for future librarians. We were extremely fortunate that Fred and Eleanor chose to retire to Chapel Hill because Sills and its students benefited in so many ways from their choice. Fred greatly enjoyed working with Sills students, and he had taught seminars and he worked with doctoral students during the 1990s. While I was student, Fred always attended faculty meetings. He was intensely interested in the school and the curriculum, and he always wanted to discuss how we could do things better. Fred was always pushing to challenge the status quo. I remember once he brought an e-book reader to faculty meeting. Now, this was one of the first readers on the market, and I don't think any of us had actually seen one before. Fred brought it in, he demonstrated its features, and then he announced categorically that this was the future, and that soon students would not have to use paper textbooks at all. Fred was often years ahead of others in thinking about technology and its uses, and he always wanted to be sure that SIL students had access to the very latest. He was also a proponent of students having a chance to experience librarianship outside of the U.S. I often discussed international programs with him, and he was very pleased when in 1991 we started a program with the Bodleian Library at Oxford. But he wanted us to have more such partnerships. And one autumn, I think it was about 1993, he came bustling into my office. He and Eleanor had visited the Czech Republic that summer, and he had found us another partner. We were supposed to partner with Charles University in Prague. He said I should immediately investigate the possibility of us working with folks at Prague. Well, for those of you who know Fred, you understand it was very difficult to ignore his suggestions. We had a student exchange program in place with Prague within a year, and about 7 years ago we began our successful Prague summer seminars, all as a result of Fred. And Fred and Eleanor gave a lasting gift to the school when they endowed the Kilgore Faculty Development Fund, which provides SILS faculty with funding to travel or do research so we could continue to investigate those questions that he always found so fascinating. SILS faculty and students have benefited and will continue to benefit from Fred and Eleanor in the future. I could go on and on about Fred, but I need to close. But I don't want to end without mentioning one last element of Fred that made him especially splendid. And that element was Eleanor. As all of you who know them realize, they were a wonderful team throughout their long marriage. Eleanor was sometimes in the background, but she was always there, working with and supporting Fred in his endeavors. I was fortunate to have the chance to know both of them, and I want to express my thanks for what they have meant to me personally and for all of us at SILS. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. As you've heard from my colleagues who work closely with him, Fred brought dignity and intellect and a special prominence to the School of Information and Library Science when he joined the faculty. As you might imagine, both students and faculty alike had a high regard for Fred, even though he was incredibly down to earth. Fred interacted with SILS students not only by teaching classes and supervising master's papers, he also regularly met with them and was able to get involved in their projects. He would sometimes attend as a guest in a colleague's class, contributing points about his own work and how and what he had done related to what the students were learning. In one class, he spoke about how the Dewey Decimal Classification System had value in many domains beyond the library. He was captivating. He was able to gain the attention of students who might not have been quite as entertained with the subject being taught had it not been for Fred. Mark Twain once said, "Great people are those who can make others feel that they too can become great." This seemed to be the message that Fred exuded as he casually stopped by his fellow professors' offices and shared exciting ideas for projects. To support his ideas, he created a special fund, the Kilgore Faculty Development Fund that Barbara mentioned, that provides seed money to encourage faculty to work on special projects. And some faculty members are still involved in projects that Fred recommended. I met Fred in I think it was the mid-1970s. The British Library Research and Development Department decided to create an annual lecture. And they invited Fred, I believe, to be the first such lecturer. And you might imagine this sent rumblings through the British library community who felt it should be a Brit giving the first lecture. But I was fortunate to attend that lecture, and Fred came in and he gave a talk about the future of the networked electronic age. He thought so far ahead of that audience that people weren't just confused and bewildered about what Fred was talking about. They were angry. They were angry. One, he was an American coming over to give the British Library lecture, but also they couldn't understand what the heck he was talking about so far out in the future. It was really quite an interesting and extraordinary event for me to attend. And over the years, as I got to know Fred, through ACIS, actually, I should mention this to our students, that it was through the Professional Association that I had much closer contact with Fred over the years, would see him every year. But I would remind him of things that he had pointed out in that lecture, and gradually, one by one, everything he said started to become the norm in the way we behaved and the way we dealt with electronic information. So in a sense, I saw Fred as being somebody who saw over the horizon. He didn't just see the horizon, he saw beyond it. But he had worked out all the mechanics and all the workings of how to get from where we were today to over that horizon. Jay mentioned the lead obituary in the New York Times. I noticed in reading the Chronicle of Higher Education recently, I can't remember exactly which issue it was either the December or the January issue. There was a multiple choice quiz on higher education. I love quizzes. So I was completing, filling it out, seeing which answers I could give, and one of the questions was, which intellectual luminary passed away in July 2006? Item C, it was multiple choice, was Frederick G. Kilgore. I predict that it won't be more than a year or so before Kilgour becomes the solution to a crossword puzzle. It will become that much immortalized, at least in the higher education community. But Fred had this rare combination of extraordinary vision and ingenuity to design and develop solutions to critical problems in improving access to information. His contributions to the field were obviously numerous and far-reaching, and those of us at SILS were honored to have him join us in his later years. Fred had footprints at SILS even when he was no longer physically coming into the building, and I remember in 2004, the fall of 2004 when I arrived, I was just delighted because here I was going to have the opportunity to interact more with Fred. But my first interactions were through Rebecca. I would see Rebecca leaving from the library, heavy book bags, and so I would open the door to help her get out. And I'd say, what are you doing? And she goes, I'm carrying these books to Fred. This is his latest order for books. He needs them for the book that he's writing. And Rebecca would go back and forward with book bags every week or so. It seemed that you were always there. And then occasionally I remember, Marcia, that typing would come in for you, and you would be dealing with typing some of Fred's work. So even when he didn't come in, he was still very, very present. As one of our faculty has said, Fred is still teaching us today, and I'm sure he'll expect us to continue learning and improving information services for the future. So ladies and gentlemen, on July 31st, 2006, the information and library science field truly lost one of its tallest giants. We're now going to take a short break before we hear from Michael Tiemann. I'd like to thank the SILS Alumni Association for providing the continental breakfast this morning. And if you haven't had a cup of coffee,